Thank you, Professor అమయ్ కుమార్ బాక్షి. వారి ఇప్పుడే చెప్పినట్టు వారి వినికిడి సమస్య ఉంది, అందుకని వారికి ఉద్దేశించిన ప్రశ్నలని రాతపూర్వకంగా ఇవ్వండి, ఇంగ్లీష్లో రాసి ఇవ్వండి. ఎవరైనా తెలుగులో రాయదలుచుకుంటే రాసినా పర్లేదు, మేము వారికి ట్రాన్స్లేట్ చేసి ఇస్తాం. నౌ ఐ ఇన్వైట్ ప్రొఫెసర్ ప్రభాత్ పట్నాయక్ to deliver his speech. He is going to speak about patterns of class formation since independence.
Comrade Raghavallu, Professor Ramyo Bagchi, Professor Ijaz Ahmed, comrades and friends. It's an honor to be associated with any event that bears the name of Comrade P. Sundaraya. Not only was he an outstanding leader of the communist movement in this country, but in the entire galaxy of communist leaders anywhere in the world, it would be difficult to come across anyone who combined in the same measure dedication to the cause of the people, with the concern for comrades, with an extraordinarily Spartan lifestyle, and of course with a meticulous thoroughness which was legendary. Comrade E.M.S. Namboodiripad, who was brought to the movement by Comrade Sundaraya, in his autobiography, How I Became a Communist, has a chapter in which he discusses Comrade Sundaraya's extraordinarily Spartan lifestyle through a number of episodes of the time when they used to meet before he joined the communist movement. As a matter of fact, a political opponent of Comrade Sundaraya, a class opponent, Neelam Sanjeeva Reddy, who went on to become president of the country, once called Comrade P.S. the Marxist Mahatma, which in a sense captures the kind of person that he was. This combination of Spartan lifestyle together with extraordinarily concern and care for comrades is something of which my first direct experience was when I attended my first party congress that was in Vijayawada in 1981. There was a hall in which dharis were spread out and all of us just slept one after another, and therefore the material conditions of life, you can imagine, of the delegates to the party congress were very Spartan. But there was a group of extraordinarily dedicated volunteers. We were told, personally instructed by Comrade P.S., who looked after us with such great loving care. Many of them, I believe, are today in the leadership of the communist movement in Andhra Pradesh. But that was really an extraordinary experience that we all had. My first meeting, of course, was in a decade earlier, in 1971, when I was teaching in Cambridge, occupying a post which Professor Bagchi had just vacated, and my teacher in college, Matthew Kurians, wrote me a letter. When the communist split took place, you may recall that most of the intellectuals, outstanding, well-known communist intellectuals, went to the CPI. As a result, the CPIM was trying to build up a cadre of intellectuals, and Matthew Kurian was organizing a conference in Madras Christian College, Tambaram in 1971 to actually put together a number of intellectuals who can then actually work for the CPIM. I think many of today's leaders in the CPIM, like Prakash Karat and so on, were people who are associated with that conference. I think Comrade Raghavallu would have been too young for that. And to that I had come, and Matthew told me that PS wants to talk to you. So I was naturally a bit scared. I was 25 years old, general secretaries of communist parties. PS was then the general secretary of CPIM. Did not talk to one easily. One didn't have easy access to them. I was a bit scared, so he came in. He told me, I liked your paper, it's very good, but I find that in some of your expressions there is a touch of Naxalite thinking. Now, the fact that not only, I had mentioned somewhere about the bourgeoisie being subordinated to imperialism, the fact that not only had he read the paper, but read it with such thoroughness that he even noticed these little expressions is something which really was the kind of meticulous person that Comrade P.S. was. Talking today, I really talk to the degree of fear that suppose he had been in the audience, then he may not have liked what I'm going to say, at least even if he would have liked, that fear remains in my mind. What I'm going to talk about today is really a contrast between the classical experience of capitalist development and the kind of capitalist development that we are witnessing in India today. Now, I think this contrast is something which is best summarized if we begin with a view of capitalism that normally most people have. And that view is that capitalism destroys pre-capitalist production systems, and of course the workforce that is released by this destruction is then eventually absorbed in large measure into the active army of labor under capitalism, and to some extent remains as a part of the reserve army of labor under capitalism, and that this happens through the spontaneous working of the system. That capitalism, even as it destroys earlier modes of production, nonetheless at the same time absorbs those who had been so displaced, who were workers in the earlier modes of production, in a way where they now begin to form a proletariat under capitalism. Now, this view is very common. This view is something which, for instance, even in the famous debate on poverty after the Industrial Revolution between Max Hartwell and Eric Hobsbawm, while Hartwell was basically denying that there was any increase in poverty, even Eric Hobsbawm, who talked about an increase in poverty following early Industrial Revolution, nonetheless suggests, at least implicitly, that yes, but this began to reduce after those displaced by early Industrial Revolution began to get absorbed in the active army of labor. That capitalism eventually, after a period of transition, begins to absorb in large measure, leaving aside a certain reserve army, large measure those who had been displaced. This is there, for instance, even implicit even in Professor Amartya Sen's comment when he talked about London and Manchester not having been built without displacing some peasants. The suggestion, of course, is that if not those peasants exactly, but their descendants are ones who ultimately then begin to get absorbed into the productive system called capitalism, and therefore the travails they face because they are displaced are necessarily transitional. Now, I believe this is not a correct understanding. I believe the fact that those displaced by capitalism's destruction of the older modes of production, the older communities, the fact that they got absorbed in some sense, or the fact that they did not continue to remain unemployed forever, is something which was because of three very exceptional, among other things, three very exceptional circumstances which prevailed at that time. The first exceptional circumstance, which do not any longer obtain, was a massive migration from Europe to the temperate lands of white settlement, about which Professor Bagchi has written at great length. 50 million Europeans in the 19th century actually went over to the temperate regions of white settlement like Canada, United States, Australia, New Zealand, and so on, and that was a substantial outflow. How substantial it was is something which would become clear if we just take the case of one country. In Britain, between 1815 and 1910, 16 million people migrated out of Britain, while Britain's population on the base date, that is in 1815, was only 12 million. In fact, almost half the increase of the population annually migrated out of Britain. If you want to put it in a comparative perspective, if you had emigration from India on the same scale, then between independence and today, 40 crore Indians should have migrated. Now, obviously, there is no place in the world to which they can migrate, and therefore, the idea that that specific circumstance can prevail in today's world is obviously far-fetched. The second factor which helped, in a sense, in preventing a substantial addition to the reserve army of labor was the fact that exporting unemployment was available to Britain, as Professor Bagchi was discussing, that basically British goods could be sold in the colonial and semi-colonial markets which were available to them on a tap. They could just open the tap and of course sell their goods here. The long Victorian and Edwardian boom, which John Hicks, the economist, called the great long boom of capitalism prior to the First World War, is something that simply would not have been possible if this colonial and semi-colonial markets were not available to Britain, which was then the leading capitalist country. As a matter of fact, even at the end of the century, as Hobsbawm shows, half of British exports consisted of textiles, and most of them were going either to India or to China. Now, obviously, therefore, that colonial, and where they were displacing the traditional petty producers. So you have an export of unemployment, which of course at the same time props up the domestic system and gives rise to a certain degree of absorption of those producers who had been displaced. And the third factor is the fact that in much of the 19th century, machine making was an extraordinarily labor-intensive occupation. A lot of the machines were actually made by bare hands almost. As a result, what you had is that even though a lot of workers could get displaced through machine using, at the same time, making machines, making of those machines whose use would destroy workers is something that also absorbed a lot of the workers. I have a feeling that some of Marx's prognostications about the falling rate of profit and rising organic composition of capital might have been inspired by that experience, where you actually find that the labor embodied in machine making was extremely high, because machine making itself was not necessarily a particularly mechanized process. At any rate, these are the extenuating circumstances which were available to capitalism in its classical phase, and of course none of them is available to countries like India, which are late industrializers in that sense. Not only are these not available to countries like India, not only is it the case that they actually carry with them a legacy of vast unemployment and mass poverty, which is left behind by colonialism, as Professor Bagchi was arguing. But what is more, they are specifically handicapped under the neoliberal regime, or I should say handicapped, and they're specifically characterized under the neoliberal regime by three features which make absorption of labor extremely difficult. Now, the first feature, of course, is that you have, in this very period, the following scenario. Let's imagine that a country is saddled to start with substantial labor reserves. This has the effect of keeping real result under neoliberal capitalism. There is a tendency for the relative size of the labor reserves, far from reducing, of actually going on increasing, even in periods of high growth, and of course still faster in periods when you have a collapse of the growth rates. Now, this has a number of very important implications. The first implication, of course, is that Marx's perception that, okay, under capitalism, you have capitalism, despite, against its very wishes, bringing into being a substantial workforce, a substantial proletariat, which, as it were, forms a new community, and that leads on to a transcendence of capitalism with the introduction of theory from outside. That view is something which, in the current conjuncture, becomes more difficult to correspond to reality, or reality is far more difficult for reality to correspond to that view, because that process of formation of the proletariat is something which gets hindered by the fact that you have informal employment, intermittent employment, casual employment, all of which are really euphemisms for an increase in the size of the reserve army of labor. What is more, even the active army of labor is increasingly pushed into informal and casual, in informality and casualization, so that far from there being a force that gets built up, that goes from strength to strength, you actually find that tendency being reversed, counteracted, repressed, turned back in the era of neoliberal capitalism, because of the fact that you find that labor reserves grow very rapidly relative to the active army of labor. Now this has of course a number of economic implications. I need not go into them. For instance, if you look at India, the real wage rate of organized industrial workers between 1988-89 and today is something, and 2009-10 has not increased. Notwithstanding substantial increases in labor productivity, you find that the real wage rate in absolute terms has, if anything, actually come down during this period, which by the way is a phenomenon you find in other countries as well, the feature of neoliberal capitalism. You also find a concerted attack on the rights of trade unions, quite apart from the spontaneous weakening of trade unions that comes about because of the fact that it's far more difficult to organize so-called informal workers, casual workers, and so on. There is an attack on the rights of trade unions, which of course the government has not yet succeeded in pushing through under the rubric of the so-called labor market flexibility, which is nothing else but really a class assault by the bourgeoisie, by the corporate financial interests on the organized working class. But one feature of it, which I really want to draw attention to, is that this gives rise to a substantial growth in what Marx had called the lumpen proletariat. Now, the lumpen proletariat, not that everybody who's informally or casually employed belongs to the lumpen proletariat, but I believe that the size of the lumpen proletariat is something which is directly related to the size of those who belong to the reserve army of labor. Marx's notion of lumpen proletariat does not only refer to the destitute and the poor. In fact, he called Louis Bonaparte a princely lumpen proletariat, and he also talked about bourgeoisie, elements of the bourgeoisie who are, decadent, being part of the lumpen proletariat. So he was not looking at the term only in terms of the poor and the destitute, but if you have a growth strategy in which not only do you have labor reserves rising relative to the active army of labor, if you have a regime of primitive accumulation of capital, if you have a regime of bubbles, of Ponzi finance, of which we have seen the latest example in West Bengal, which by the way is also a form of primitive accumulation of capital, because lots of people's savings are simply being taken away by some, it's siphoned off. So you find that therefore this is a period in which there is a substantial increase in the relative weight of the lumpen proletariat compared to that of the proletariat proper. I believe that's a major hallmark of the kind of development that we are witnessing in India. Now this of course has again a number of very important economic, social and political consequences. I'd just like to discuss one particular political consequence, and that is to do with democracy. Now anyway, globalization is something which has a fundamentally, or the pursuit of neoliberal policies which permits free flows of commodities and capital, has a fundamentally anti-democratic content. Because if the democracy means anything, what it means is that the people should be able to choose between alternative agendas and therefore between alternative political formations pushing those different agendas. But if you have a situation where, because of neoliberal economic policies and therefore the possibility of financial outflows anytime, no matter which government comes to power, as long as it remains tied to the a regime of globalization, has to pursue policies to the liking of globalized finance capital, then you have a fundamental negation of democracy. People can vote alternative governments, but all of them end up pursuing the same policies, which is forced upon them by the fact that as long as they remain part of the globalized regime, they have to please finance capital. But this, of course, raises the danger that sometimes some government may come that wishes to de-link itself from the globalized regime. And this danger continues to haunt the corporate financial interests who are linked to globalized finance capital. True that this danger is something against which all kinds of safeguards in quotes exist. First is that even if you had such a government, the immediate outflow of finance can be so large that even before any capital controls have been put in, the country would have already been brought down to its knees. As a matter of fact, in the years when Nelson Mandela was coming to power in South Africa, there were such massive capital outflows that Nelson Mandela had to actually appoint Derek Keyes, who was the finance minister of the apartheid government, as the finance minister of the new government, in order to retain what is called in quotes the confidence of the investors. So there is that safeguard. There is, of course, the fundamental class safeguard that, as long as the corporate financial interests themselves, who control the media and so on, are wedded or are a part of the globalized finance, as long as the bubble-sustained boom keeps sections of the urban middle classes happy, you have a substantial social support for it, where it is not even possible quite easily to have a regime that even wishes to delink. But nonetheless, that danger remains, and it remains particularly in periods of crisis. And therefore, a tendency develops, as far as the corporate financial interests are concerned, of directly controlling the state. Not indirectly, indirect controls they have, but directly controlling the state. Indirect controls, as I said, they have because you have, after all key positions of decision making which have been given out to employees and ex-employees of the World Bank. You look at finance minister, you look at anywhere, they basically, all planning commission, prime minister, secretary, they are the ones who actually control key levers of decision making. At the same time, when it comes to the traditional political class, which has been, as it were, made to relinquish these key levers of decision making, corruption plays a very important role in actually making them accept this new development. Professor Bagchi was talking about the colonial times. It's a bit like Robert Clive actually giving some money to the Mughal emperor in order to take away the Diwani of Bengal and so on. In other words, you have, as it were, a system that pays off the traditional politicians in order to take away from them the rights to key decision making, which are then entrusted to the employees and ex-employees of World Bank, IMF, and the so-called global financial community. Now, all those are there. Additionally, there are deeper social kind of problems in the way of such delinking. The link with communalism, which I believe Aja was talking about, is one very important kind of thing, which keeps people disunited, etc., etc. But nonetheless, there is a degree of uncertainty, and therefore globalized finance, with which our corporate financial interests are closely aligned, would like a direct control of the state. There is a further reason for it. The further reason is that the conquest of the economy by the corporate financial elite is not complete. True, there has been substantial liberalization, but don't forget, in India, there are still some checks. You still have a public sector in which the Navaratnas are still, as it were, despite substantial disinvestment, are still state-owned. You still have a banking system in which the bulk of the banks are still state-controlled. A former governor of the Reserve Bank of India was once telling us that again and again from America, you have had Geithner, you have Summers, you have various people coming and saying that, look, just do one thing. Privatize the State Bank of India. But State Bank of India still has not been privatized. You have a situation where autonomy of the central bank is still not achieved. You have a situation where, even though it appeared prior to 2008 that the system of procurement of crops and so on is progressively going to be abandoned, it has been refurbished, if you like, in the period of price rise after 2008. So you have a situation where the withdrawal of the state from a certain supporting role is not as complete as corporate financial interests would like to have it, and therefore their conquest of the economy is not as complete as they would like to have it. For that reason, again, they would like a direct control over the state. And I think moves towards such a direct control are obvious. Moves towards such a direct control are obvious, for instance, in the touting of a man who is now being openly projected as the darling of the corporate sector, as the coming prime minister. Now, it's not as if they are unhappy with the current prime minister, but the point is it's an insurance policy, and at the same time they want to legitimize a situation in which a corporate nominee for prime ministership can be openly projected. I don't know if you have seen, the Times of India was running a poll recently should India Incorporated have a say in how tax revenues are going to be spent? Now, democracy is the people who have a say, but India Incorporated wishes to have an additional say over and above all this, which basically means a degree of direct control over the state. In 2004, when the NDA government lost, Wall Street Journal had an article in which it said, but this is absurd, you cannot have in a country like India, newly emerging economy, all stakeholders must have a say in who the new government is going to be. Why only the electorate? All stakeholders, including foreign capital, including India Incorporated, must have a say in who is going to be elected. So the idea of the direct control over the state by corporate financial interests for these reasons is something which is gaining ground. Now, direct control by the state over, by the corporate financial interest over the state is typically what we associate with fascism. Now, of course, we think of fascism always in terms of the 1930s. Since in 1930s, fascism basically meant, in Kalevsky's terms, no next government. So we think in terms of fascism as a form of governance in which there is no next government. But let's not forget that in the 1930s, you had a situation where finance capital was still nation-based. You had German finance capital, the Krupps and so on, who were backing the Nazis. Now you have a period of a situation of globalized finance capital in which there are already checks and balances against what the next government can do. In the 1930s, again, you had, as Omyoda said, a substantial threat of communist takeover. In Germany, the communist revolution had been defeated, but nonetheless, there was a very strong communist party. And what is more, if you look at the working class parties as a whole, social democratic as well as revolutionary, they actually commanded the majority of votes. And therefore, permitting a next government is something which was extremely dangerous, and therefore fascism took that kind of a form. In today's context, I see no reason why you cannot have kinds of experiment with fascism in which there may be elections, but as long as no matter who the election throws up as the next government, the corporate financial elite directly controls the state, and as long as the working class movement and the communists are ruthlessly suppressed, physically, coercively suppressed, then that can be a form of fascist experiment. Now, I think that kind of creeping fascism is already visible in India. And in my view, the relative increase in the weight of the lumpen proletariat as opposed to the proletariat is something which is very helpful to the corporate financial elite from this point of view. We don't have to go very far. In West Bengal, a political party which is basically recruited from the lumpen proletariat, as is clear from this latest scam in which virtually comprehensive involvement of that political party. Now, insofar as you can have that political party engaged in a real ruthless suppression of the communists. Now, this is something which, even if that party itself is not directly promoting any corporate financial agenda, that party is nonetheless helping the emergence of corporate financial control in a direct sense as far as the state is concerned. Now, I think the fact that this capitalist development throws up a situation in which the relative social weight of the lumpen proletariat is greater than of the proletariat, or could be greater, or is greater certainly than the proletariat compared to classical capitalism, is a matter which is of very serious concern as far as the preservation of democracy in this country is concerned. If one thinks in terms of the long period of colonial struggle as anti-colonial struggle as India's long revolution, then we are witnessing a counter-revolution today, which has many features. One feature, of course, is the rise in inequality, the rise in the size of the relative labor reserves, and so on, informal employment, casual, and all the rest of it, and its economic implications. The second feature is in the realm of foreign policy, where you have much closer integration with US imperialism, talk in terms of a US-Israel-India axis, but certainly a third feature of this counter-revolution is a relative increase in the size of the lumpen proletariat compared to the proletariat, which, as I said, has very important political implications. Of course, it has very important social implications. Some of these we are seeing in the extremely increased incidence of gender oppression, which is now coming to light. Certainly there are many factors behind it, but in my view, the lumpenization of society that comes with this increased weight of the lumpen proletariat is certainly one factor, but I think the political consequences of it is something which especially those in the left have to be extremely conscious of. Thank you.